Hello, Guy. Welcome back to my channel. Let's begin together. We live in a world of breathtaking complexity, a world of our own making. Our societies are built on intricate systems of law. Our cities are powered by feats of engineering. Our minds are shaped by the rigors of science, and our lives are recorded in an endless, cascading stream of digital information. It feels entirely new, a landscape forged by the relentless progress of recent centuries, a testament to the power of the modern mind. But what if the blueprint for our world is far older than we imagine? What if the invisible architecture that supports our most advanced institutions was drafted thousands of years ago, not in silicon and steel, but in clay, papyrus, and stone? This is the story of those ancient echoes, the powerful, often hidden, currents of history that flow from the ancient world directly into our own. It is a journey to uncover the ancient DNA embedded in our modern life, to discover that we are, in so many ways, still walking in the footsteps of the past. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our journey into the deep past begins here, in a sun-scorched, flat and fertile plain, nestled between two great rivers. To the ancient Greeks, this land was known as Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. Today, it is the heartland of modern Iraq. It is a landscape that can seem, to the untrained eye, empty and monotonous. But it was here, in this seemingly unremarkable expanse of earth, that the very first stirrings of what we call civilization began. It was here that humanity first learned to live in cities, to organize itself into states, and to build monumental structures of mud brick that reached for the heavens. And it was here, driven by the most mundane of necessities, that our ancestors stumbled upon the single most transformative technology in human history. It was a technology that would allow us to conquer the limitations of our own minds, to defeat the tyranny of forgetting, and to speak across the silent chasm of time and death. This is the story of the birth of writing. It is a story that begins not with a poet or a king, but with an accountant, and not with a grand epic, but with a humble list of sheep. To understand why writing was born here, we must first understand the unique environment of southern Mesopotamia, a region known as Sumer. This was a land of stark and violent contrasts. The two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, brought life-giving water and incredibly fertile alluvial silt to the plain, allowing for the cultivation of massive agricultural surpluses, particularly of barley. But the rivers were also unpredictable and destructive, their floods capable of wiping out entire settlements. The land away from the rivers was harsh desert, and the climate was one of blistering heat and meager rainfall. To survive and thrive in this challenging environment, the early inhabitants, the Sumerians, were forced to develop a new and unprecedented level of social cooperation. They had to work together on a massive scale to build and maintain the complex network of irrigation canals that watered their fields, to construct dikes to protect them from the floods, and to manage the surplus grain that would see them through the lean years. This need for large-scale, coordinated labor was the catalyst for the birth of the city. Around the 4th millennium BCE, settlements in Sumer began to grow dramatically in size and complexity. Villages became towns, and towns became the world's first true cities. The greatest of these was Uruk, a sprawling urban center that at its peak may have been home to over 50,000 people. This was a level of social organization that the world had never seen before. The city was a buzzing, complex machine. It had a centralized religious authority centered on the great temples dedicated to the city's patron gods. It had a political hierarchy with a priest-king who managed the city's resources. And it had a specialized economy with farmers, potters, weavers, metal workers, and merchants all contributing their skills. This new urban organism, with its thousands of inhabitants and complex economic relationships, generated a problem of unprecedented scale, an information overload. The temple administrators who were responsible for managing the city's wealth faced a daunting task. They needed to keep track of the immense quantities of grain coming into the temple granaries, the number of livestock in the temple herds, the rations being paid out to temple workers, and the goods being sent out with trade caravans. Human memory, the sole information storage system for all of previous history, had finally reached its breaking point. The first solution to this problem was a simple but ingenious system of clay tokens. For centuries, people in the Near East had used small, shaped pieces of fired clay to represent commodities. A small cone might represent a small measure of grain, a sphere a larger measure, and a disk might represent a head of livestock. It was a simple one-to-one correspondence, a tangible system of accounting. If a farmer deposited 10 measures of barley at the temple granary, he might be given 10 clay tokens as a form of receipt. This system worked well for simple transactions, but it was cumbersome. As the economy grew more complex, the number and variety of tokens became unmanageable. A more efficient system was needed. The first great innovation was the creation of the bulla, a hollow clay ball. To record a complex transaction, the relevant tokens would be placed inside the bulla, which was then sealed shut. To prevent fraud, the administrator would impress the images from a cylinder seal, a small, carved stone cylinder that was unique to an individual or an office, onto the wet clay of the bulla's exterior. This was a form of signature, a guarantee of authenticity. This system, however, had a major drawback. To check the contents of a bulla, you had to break it open, destroying the record. Sometime around 3500 BCE, a Sumerian accountant had a brilliant, revolutionary idea. Before sealing the tokens inside the bulla, he would press the tokens themselves into the soft clay of the exterior. Now the outside of the bulla carried a perfect impression of the tokens that were sealed inside. The external signs corresponded directly to the internal objects, and this led very quickly to the next, even more profound cognitive leap. Someone realized that if the marks on the outside perfectly represented the tokens, then the tokens themselves were no longer necessary. You could dispense with the entire clumsy system of tokens and bulla and simply make the impressions on a solid, flat piece of clay. This was the moment of Genesis. This was the birth of the tablet and the birth of writing. The three-dimensional objects representing goods were replaced by two-dimensional signs representing those objects. It was a pivotal moment of abstraction, the first step on the long road from accounting to literature. The earliest writing, which we call protocuneiform, was purely pictographic. The signs were simple, recognizable pictures of the things they represented. A drawing of a head of barley meant barley. A drawing of an ox's head meant ox. And a drawing of a human head with a bowl meant to eat or ration. Alongside these pictograms were numerical signs, simple impressions made with the end of a stylus to represent quantities. These early tablets, dating from the end of the 4th millennium BCE, found in the temple precinct at Uruk, are almost exclusively administrative and economic records. They are lists of goods, inventories of livestock, records of land sales, and tallies of worker rations. They are deeply, profoundly unexciting to read, but they are among the most important documents in human history. They represent a new technology for managing reality, a tool for imposing order on an increasingly complex economic world. This was not yet a system for writing language. It was a system for recording things. The next great evolutionary step was driven by the medium itself. Drawing curved, detailed pictures in wet clay with a pointed stylus is a slow and messy business. The clay clumps and the lines are imprecise. Over several centuries, the Sumerian scribes gradually simplified and rationalized their script to make it better suited to the clay tablet. They abandoned the pointed stylus in favor of a new tool, likely a piece of reed, with its end cut to form a sharp, straight edge. Instead of drawing the signs, the scribe would now impress them into the clay. By pressing the corner of this stylus into the clay, they could create a neat, wedge-shaped mark. By combining these wedge-shaped marks in various combinations, they could create any sign they needed. This new method was faster, cleaner, and more efficient. It also gave the script its modern name, cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. The pictograms of old became increasingly abstract. Their visual connection to the original object eventually lost, transformed into elegant, efficient patterns of wedges. This change in the form of the script was accompanied by an even more important change in its function. This was the development of the rebus principle, the same conceptual leap that would later be made in Egypt and China. The scribes began to use the now abstract signs, not just to represent an object, but to represent the sound of the word for that object. The Sumerian word for arrow was T. The cuneiform sign for arrow could now also be used to write the word life, which was also pronounced T. The meaning of the sign was now disconnected from its original pictographic origin and tied to its phonetic value. This was the moment that writing became a tool for recording spoken language. By combining these phonetic signs, a scribe could now spell out words that had no simple pictographic representation, abstract concepts like love, justice, or fear, and the grammatical elements of speech that hold sentences together. The administrative tool for listing sheep had become a fully fledged writing system capable of capturing the entire universe of human thought and speech. The technology of the writing materials themselves was a masterpiece of simplicity and sustainability. The primary medium was the clay tablet. A scribe would take a lump of refined, wet clay and pat it into a smooth, pillow-shaped tablet, small enough to be held comfortably in one hand. The surface was made perfectly smooth, ready to receive the impressions of the stylus. The stylus itself was typically made from a reed, cut from the marshes of the great rivers. The scribe would write on the wet clay, his movements quick and precise. If a mistake was made, it could be easily erased by smoothing over the clay with a thumb. Once the text was complete, the tablet could be left to dry in the sun. This created a reasonably durable record. For everyday documents, this was sufficient. If the tablet was no longer needed, it could simply be soaked in water and recycled back into a fresh lump of clay. However, if a document was deemed important enough for permanent preservation, a royal inscription, a religious text, a legal code, the tablet would be fired in a kiln, just like a piece of pottery. This turned the clay into a ceramic, making the record virtually indestructible. It is this act of deliberate preservation that has given us our library of the ancient Near East. A library of baked earth. The cuneiform script, once perfected by the Sumerians, proved to be an incredibly successful and adaptable technology. It was adopted and modified by a whole succession of cultures and civilizations that dominated Mesopotamia over the next 3,000 years. The Akkadians, a Semitic-speaking people who rose to power under Sargon the Great, adapted the cuneiform script to write their own, very different language. This was a complex process, as the Sumerian script was primarily logographic and syllabic, while the Akkadian language was consonantal. The scribes had to develop new phonetic values for the signs and use them in new ways. Later, the Babylonians and the Assyrians, who also spoke dialects of Akkadian, continued to use and refine the cuneiform script. It became the lingua franca of the entire Near East. A Hittite king in Anatolia would use cuneiform to correspond with a pharaoh in Egypt. The great law code of the Babylonian king Hammurabi, with its famous principle of an eye for an eye, was inscribed in beautiful cuneiform on a massive black diorite stela for all to see. The script was so successful that it remained in continuous use for over 3 millennia, a far longer lifespan than the Latin alphabet has yet enjoyed. The ability to read and write this complex script was not a common skill. It required years of intensive, specialized training. This gave rise to a new and powerful class of urban professionals, the scribes. A young boy destined for the scribal profession, usually the son of a wealthy or influential family, would be sent to a special school, the Edeba, or tablet house. The training was long, arduous, and often brutal. Surviving texts from these schools, known as school day texts, paint a vivid picture of student life. The students would spend their days, from sunrise to sunset, learning the hundreds of cuneiform signs and the complex rules of grammar and vocabulary. The curriculum was based on endless memorization and a great deal of corporal punishment. One text humorously describes a student being caned for his poor handwriting, for talking in class, for having dirty clothes, and for standing up without permission. The goal of this harsh education was to produce a highly disciplined and literate professional who could serve the needs of the temple, the palace, or the world of commerce. The graduate of the Edeba was a member of a privileged elite. In a world where over 99% of the population was illiterate, the scribe held the keys to the kingdom of information. Scribes were the administrators, the accountants, the lawyers, and the civil servants of the ancient Mesopotamian world. They ran the great temple estates, managed the royal treasuries, drafted legal contracts, and took down the dictation of kings. Their skill gave them access to power and wealth, and they were often proud of their profession, looking down on the manual laborers who worked with their hands. Be a scribe, one piece of fatherly advice reads. It is a profession that is sweet, and you are suited for it. The scribal class was the essential administrative backbone of the Mesopotamian state. Without their ability to record, calculate, and archive, the complex urban societies of the ancient Near East would have been impossible to manage. They were the invisible architects of the state, their styluses as mighty as any king's scepter. While the primary function of writing remained administrative, it was not long before this powerful new technology was turned to other purposes. The scribes of the Edaba had to practice their writing by copying out long lists of words, proverbs, hymns, and myths. Over time, this scholastic tradition led to the birth of literature. The great myths and legends of Mesopotamia, which had for centuries been passed down through oral tradition, were now written down, given a fixed and permanent form. The most famous of these is the Epic of Gilgamesh, a profound and moving story about a Sumerian king's quest for immortality. It is a tale of friendship, adventure, the fear of death, and the search for meaning, and it contains a story of a great flood that predates the biblical account of Noah by over 1,000 years. The epic survives today because some anonymous scribes, thousands of years ago, took the time to painstakingly impress the story, wedge by wedge, onto a series of 12 clay tablets. The invention of writing allowed for the transition from an oral to a literary culture, creating a new and enduring medium for the human imagination. The development of writing also had a profound impact on the development of law and the concept of justice. In a pre-literate society, law is a matter of custom and memory, dispensed by village elders or a king, and subject to the frailties of both. The act of writing down the law was a revolutionary step. It took the law out of the hands of a single individual and placed it in the public domain, making it objective, permanent, and, in theory, applicable to all. The earliest known law codes come from Mesopotamia, long before the famous Code of Hammurabi. The laws of Ur-Nem, from the city of Ur around 2100 BCE, are the oldest surviving example. These codes were not comprehensive legal treatises, but rather a list of specific rulings for specific cases. They covered everything from divorce and inheritance to assault and agricultural disputes. By inscribing these laws on a public monument, the king was presenting himself not as an arbitrary ruler, but as a shepherd of his people, a guarantor of justice and order under the watchful eyes of the gods. Written law was a technology for creating a more stable, predictable, and just society. The accumulation of centuries of written records in the great temple and palace. Archives also led to the birth of history. For the first time, scribes could look back at the records of previous generations. They began to compile lists of their kings, noting the lengths of their reigns and their major accomplishments. They wrote chronicles, recording significant events year by year, great battles, the construction of temples, famines, and floods. This was a new way of thinking about the past. It was no longer a fluid, mythic dream time, but a linear sequence of verifiable events. This new historical consciousness was a direct product of the archival technology of the clay tablet. It allowed a society to have a memory, to construct a narrative of its own past, and to learn from its successes and failures. The scribes of Mesopotamia were the world's first historians, their work made possible by the simple act of recording the present for the future. The impact of writing was not limited to the humanities. The administrative need for precise measurement and calculation drove the development of mathematics and astronomy. The Sumerians and Babylonians developed a sophisticated number system, the sexagesimal system, which was based on the number 60. This is an incredibly versatile system for calculation, and its echo is still with us today in our measurement of time, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and in the 360 degrees of a circle. The scribes used their mathematical skills to calculate land areas for taxation, to compute the interest on loans, and to project the yields of their harvests. This same mathematical skill, combined with the long-term records of celestial events kept in the temple archives, allowed the Babylonians to become the most advanced astronomers of the ancient world. They could predict the movements of the planets, chart the course of the stars, and most importantly, predict lunar and solar eclipses, which were seen as potent divine omens. This was not science for its own sake. It was a practical tool for understanding the will of the gods and for maintaining the sacred calendar that governed the agricultural and religious life of the state. The modern echo of this ancient Mesopotamian invention is so profound and all-encompassing that it is almost impossible to overstate. Every single time we read a book, sign a contract, send an email, or even check a price tag in a supermarket, we are engaging in an activity that is the direct, lineal descendant of the system developed by those Sumerian accountants over 5,000 years ago. The Latin alphabet we use today is a distant cousin of the scripts that evolved in the Near East, its origins tracing back through the Greek, Phoenician, and Proto-Sinaitic scripts to the hieroglyphic system of Egypt, which itself was likely inspired by the initial idea of writing from Mesopotamia. The very concept of storing information outside the human brain, the fundamental principle of all our libraries, computers, and the entire Internet, was born on those humble clay tablets. The digital revolution of our own time is merely the latest chapter in a story that began with a scribe making a list of sheep. The information age has, in a way, brought us full circle. We live in a world much like the administrators of Uruk, that is characterized by an overwhelming flood of information. We have developed new technologies, databases, spreadsheets, search engines to manage this complexity. These are the modern equivalents of the clay tablet and the stylus. A database is, in essence, a highly sophisticated list, a tool for organizing and retrieving data, just as the early cuneiform tablets were. When we type a query into a search engine, we are asking a digital scribe to consult a global library of unimaginable size, a library whose fundamental purpose, the storage and retrieval of information, is identical to that of the ancient tablet houses of Nippur and Babylon. We have changed the medium from clay to silicon, and we have increased the speed and scale by an almost infinite factor. But the underlying cognitive technology remains the same. The legacy of Mesopotamia is therefore written into the very fabric of our modern consciousness. They gave us the first cities, the first law codes, the first empires, the first literature, and the first science. But underlying all of these achievements was the foundational technology of writing. It was the software that enabled all the other complex systems of civilization to function. It was a tool that not only recorded the world, but actively reshaped it. It created new forms of power, new social classes, new ways of thinking, and new relationships with time and space. To learn to write was to learn to think in a new way, to be more linear, more analytical, and more abstract. This new cognitive mode, this literate mind, is one of the most important and enduring legacies of the ancient Near East. So, the next time you write a shopping list, or read a novel, or send a text message, it is worth pausing for a moment to remember its origins. Remember the Sumerian accountant faced with the problem of too much information and not enough memory. Remember the feel of a cool, wet clay tablet in the hand, and the crisp impression of a reed stylus making a wedge-shaped mark. Remember that the entire, vast, complex edifice of our modern, literate, information-saturated world rests upon the simple, brilliant, and world-changing idea that a mark can represent a thing, and that a thing can represent a sound. This was the Mesopotamian gift, the quiet revolution of the stylus and the tablet that first allowed humanity to write its own story. It is an echo that is not in the distant past. It is the very language you are reading, and the very thought you are thinking. Right now, the ultimate fate of the cuneiform script is a story in itself, a lesson in how even the most successful technologies eventually fade into obsolescence. For 3,000 years it was the dominant script of a vast and powerful region. But its immense complexity, with its hundreds of signs and complex rules, was also its weakness. In the first millennium BCE, a new and radically simpler technology for writing emerged in the Levant, developed by peoples like the Phoenicians, the alphabet. This was a system with only a few dozen signs, each one representing a single consonant sound. It was easy to learn, easy to use, and far more democratic than the scribal culture of cuneiform. This new alphabetic script, written on more portable media like papyrus and parchment, began to spread rapidly. By the time of the Persian Empire, Aramaic, written in an alphabetic script, had become the new lingua franca. Cuneiform was relegated to the status of a specialist religious script, used only by priests and astronomers in the ancient temples of Babylon. The last known cuneiform tablet, an astronomical text, was written in 75 CE. After that, the knowledge of how to read the wedge-shaped marks was lost, and the script, along with the civilizations that used it, fell into a deep, long silence, waiting for the spades of modern archaeologists and the brilliant minds of decipherers to bring its voice back to life. The decipherment of cuneiform in the 19th century was one of the great intellectual detective stories of all time, a feat of staggering scholarship that reopened a lost chapter of human history. Scholars like Georg Friedrich Grotefend and Henry Rawlinson, working with multilingual inscriptions like the one carved on a cliff face at Behistun in Iran, were able to slowly, painstakingly crack the code. They realized that the same text was written in 3 different languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, all using cuneiform script. By starting with the known Old Persian, they were able to gradually decipher the others. The moment of breakthrough when these long-dead languages and their strange, wedge-shaped script could finally be read again was a moment of profound revelation. It was as if an entire civilization, silent for 2,000 years, had suddenly begun to speak again. The thousands of tablets that had been excavated from the tells of Iraq, previously just mute and incomprehensible artifacts, could now be read. They gave us the voice of Gilgamesh, the laws of Hammurabi, and the daily records of a Sumerian baker. It was the technology of writing that had preserved this world, and it was the science of decipherment that gave it back to us. The story of writing is, in a way, a story about the changing hardware of the human mind. An oral culture which stores its knowledge in epic poems and memorized genealogies thinks and experiences the world in a fundamentally different way from a literate culture, which can access vast external archives of information. The invention of writing was a kind of rewiring of the human brain, a shift from a reliance on the fluid associative patterns of memory to the linear, analytical structures of written text. This shift did not happen overnight, and it was not without its losses. Plato, writing at a time when Greece was transitioning from a primarily oral to a literate culture, famously had his master Socrates warn against the dangers of writing. He argued that it would create forgetfulness because people would no longer use their memories. He believed it would produce a semblance of wisdom, but not the real thing, which could only be achieved through live, spoken dialogue. Socrates' fears were not entirely unfounded, but what he could not have foreseen was the immense, explosive power that this new technology would unlock, the ability it would give humanity to accumulate, build upon, and transmit knowledge across generations on a scale that was previously unimaginable. The physical medium of the clay tablet had a profound influence on the way the Mesopotamians organized their knowledge. The finite size of a tablet encouraged conciseness. The sequential nature of writing on a tablet encouraged the organization of information into lists, the most basic form of data structuring. The scribes of Mesopotamia were master list makers. They compiled lists of everything, lists of gods, lists of kings, lists of professions, lists of animals, lists of body parts, lists of legal precedents. This practice of listing and categorizing was a new and powerful intellectual tool. It was a way of imposing a rational human order on a complex and often chaotic world. It was the beginning of systematic scientific thought, the first step towards the encyclopedias and databases of our own time. The simple act of creating a list on a clay tablet was an act of world building, an assertion of intellectual control over the vastness of creation. We can also see an echo of the Mesopotamian scribal tradition in our modern relationship with information and power. The scribe was an essential but ultimately subservient figure, a technocrat in the service of the temple or the palace. He wielded immense power through his control of information, but he was not the ultimate source of that power. He was an intermediary, a processor of data. In our own age, the role of the scribe has been taken over by algorithms, by the vast and personal bureaucracies of corporations and governments that collect and process our data. We live in a world governed by lists and databases, by systems of information that we as individuals rarely see, but that profoundly shape our lives. The anxiety we sometimes feel about the power of these vast, faceless information systems is a modern echo of the immense social power that was first concentrated in the hands of those who could read and write the wedge-shaped marks on a piece of clay. So as we leave the fertile plains of Mesopotamia and prepare to journey west to the rocky shores of Greece, it is the legacy of the scribe that we carry with us. The technology they invented was not just about making marks. It was about creating a new kind of social memory, a collective brain for the nascent organism of civilization. It was a technology that enabled the complex administrative state, the codification of law, the birth of literature, and the beginnings of scientific thought. It was a tool that, once invented, changed not just what people could do, but what they could be. The modern world, in all its informational complexity, is a house built of words. And the foundation stone for that house, the very first word, was impressed into a piece of wet clay in a Sumerian city more than 5,000 years ago. It is an echo that is not just in our books and on our screens. It is in the very structure of our thoughts. From the fertile, alluvial plains of Mesopotamia, our journey now takes us west, across the sea, to a land of a very different character. We arrive in the rocky, sun-drenched landscape of Greece, a world of jagged coastlines, secluded valleys, and mountains that march down to the edge of the wine-dark Aegean. This is a land that does not lend itself to a single, unified riverine empire like those of Egypt or Mesopotamia. Its very geography, a scattering of arable plains isolated by rugged terrain, fostered a different kind of social organization. It was the age of the polis, the independent, fiercely proud city-state. And it was in one of these city-states, a bustling, quarrelsome, and brilliant community called Athens, that a second great social technology, as profound and as influential as writing, would be invented. This was the idea that a state could and should be governed not by a king, a god, or a small council of aristocrats, but by its own citizens. They called it democratia, or rule by the people. This was not a quiet evolution. It was a radical, messy, and often violent experiment, a social laboratory where the very foundations of Western political thought were forged. The echo of this Athenian experiment is all around us. It is in the voting booth, the jury box, and the chambers of our legislatures. It is the story of how we first learned to govern ourselves. The birth of democracy in Athens was not the product of a single enlightened thinker or a peaceful philosophical debate. It was born from centuries of intense social and political strife, a long and often bloody struggle to answer a single fundamental question: who holds power? In the archaic period that followed the collapse of the Mycenaean Bronze Age, power in Athens, as in most Greek city-states, was firmly in the hands of the aristocracy, the eupatridae, or the well-born. These were a small number of powerful, land-owning families who traced their lineage back to legendary heroes and who controlled the best agricultural land in the region of Attica. They dominated the political landscape, holding all the key magistracies and sitting on the Areopagus, the ancient council that acted as the city's supreme judicial and advisory body. For the vast majority of the population, the small farmers, the tenant laborers, the artisans, and the landless poor, life was precarious, and their political voice was non-existent by the late 7th century BCE. This deeply unequal system had pushed Athenian society to the brink of civil war. The central crisis was one of debt. The small farmers of Attica were increasingly falling into a devastating cycle of debt to their wealthy aristocratic neighbors. To secure a loan, a farmer would have to pledge his land as collateral. If he defaulted, he lost his land. If he had no land to pledge, he would have to pledge his own person and the persons of his wife and children. This led to the horrific practice of debt bondage. A free Athenian citizen could, through economic misfortune, become the property of his creditor, forced to work as a slave on the very land that his family had once owned, or even be sold abroad. A class of tenant farmers known as hectomeroi, or sixth parters, had to hand over a full 5/6 of their harvest to their aristocratic landlords, leaving them in a state of perpetual servitude. This system was not just economically ruinous. It was a profound social and moral crisis that was tearing the fabric of the polis apart. The poor grew more desperate, the rich grew more powerful, and the threat of a violent revolution loomed. The first attempt to address this crisis by codifying the law came around 621 BCE with the figure of Draco. Draco was tasked with writing down the laws of Athens for the first time, taking them from the realm of aristocratic oral tradition and placing them in the public domain. This was a crucial first step towards a more just society. However, the laws themselves were notoriously harsh. The penalty for even minor offenses, like stealing a cabbage, was death. When asked why he had fixed the same penalty for most offenses, Draco was said to have replied that small offenses deserved death, and he knew of no severer penalty for great ones. While the term draconian has come to mean excessively severe, Draco's code was not simply about cruelty. It was an attempt to replace the arbitrary and often violent system of private blood feuds with a system of state-sanctioned justice. By making the law, however harsh, explicit, and applicable to all, Draco had established a principle that was essential for the future development of democracy, the principle that the state, not the individual or the family, was the ultimate arbiter of justice. The true foundational reforms that saved Athens from implosion came in the year 594 BCE, with the appointment of Solon as chief magistrate. Solon was an aristocrat, but one who was widely respected for his wisdom and moderation. He was granted extraordinary powers to reform the state and heal its divisions. His first and most celebrated act was a radical measure known as the Sysacthia, the shaking off of burdens. He canceled all outstanding debts, public and private. He abolished the practice of debt bondage, making it illegal for any Athenian to be enslaved for their debts. He even went so far as to track down and buy back Athenians who had been sold into slavery abroad. This was a revolutionary act, a massive economic reset that liberated a huge portion of the population from servitude and restored their status as free citizens. He also reformed the system of land tenure, although he stopped short of a full-scale redistribution of land, which the poorest were demanding. Solon's economic reforms were the essential prerequisite for democracy. A man cannot be a citizen if he is another man's property. By ensuring the basic freedom of the Athenian farmer, Solon created the free and independent citizenry upon which a democracy could be built. Solon's political reforms were equally profound. He broke the absolute monopoly on power held by the old, birth-based aristocracy. He restructured the Athenian citizen body into 4 new classes, but these classes were based not on lineage, but on wealth, specifically on agricultural production. The wealthiest class, the Pentakosiamemen, or 500-bushel men, were the only ones eligible for the highest offices. The lower classes, the hippies, knights, the Zeusitai, yokemen or small farmers, and the thetes, landless laborers, had access to progressively fewer offices. This may seem undemocratic to a modern eye, but it was a radical step at the time. It meant that power was now, in theory, accessible to any man who could acquire sufficient wealth, regardless of his family name. More importantly, Solon granted the lowest class, the thetes, who formed the majority of the population, the right to attend and vote in the assembly, the ecclesia, the general gathering of all citizens. This gave them, for the first time, a direct, albeit limited, voice in the governance of their city. He also is credited with creating a new council, the Bull of 400, to prepare the agenda for the assembly, and with establishing a new court of appeal, the Heliaia, which was open to all citizens. Solon's reforms did not create a democracy, but they laid its essential groundwork, creating a new definition of citizenship and a new framework for political participation. Solon's moderate reforms, however, did not permanently solve Athens's internal conflicts. The old aristocratic factions continued to vie for power, and in the mid-6th century BCE, Athens fell under the rule of a tyrant, Pisistratus. The word tyrant in the Greek context did not necessarily mean a cruel or oppressive ruler, but simply one who had seized power by unconstitutional means. Pisistratus was, in many ways, a popular and effective ruler. He championed the cause of the common people, instituted major public works programs, and promoted Athenian culture and trade. But his rule, and that of his sons who followed him, was a step backward from the path of civic self-governance. The tyranny was eventually overthrown in 510 BCE with the help of a Spartan army, but this simply threw Athenian politics back into a state of chaos, with the old aristocratic factions once again struggling for supremacy. It was out of this renewed crisis that the true architect of Athenian democracy, Cleisthenes, would emerge. Cleisthenes, himself an aristocrat from the powerful Alcmaeonid family, had been in the thick of these political struggles. But in 508 BCE, in a bid to outmaneuver his political rivals, he took the people into his party and proposed a set of reforms so radical and so brilliant that they would shatter the old power structures forever and create the world's first true democracy. The centerpiece of his reform was an act of extraordinary social engineering. He completely redrew the political map of Attica. He understood that the real source of aristocratic power lay in their localized regional bases, where they controlled the land and the loyalty of the people who lived there. To break this power, he had to break up these regional loyalties and forge a new pan-Athenian identity. His solution was breathtaking in its ingenuity. He abolished the 4 old Ionian tribes, which were based on kinship, and created 10 new tribes, the Phylai, which would form the basis of all political and military organization. The genius of Cleisthenes' system lay in how these 10 new tribes were constructed. He first divided the entire territory of Attica into 3 geographical regions: the city, Asti, the coast, Paralia, and the inland plain, Mesogea. He then divided each of these 3 regions into 10 smaller units, called trides or thirds. So there were 10 city thirds, 10 coastal thirds, and 10 inland thirds. Each of the 10 new tribes was then formed by taking 1 trides from each of the 3 regions, 1 from the city, 1 from the coast, and 1 from the inland. The result was that each new tribe was a microcosm of all Attica. It was a deliberately fragmented, geographically non-contiguous unit that mixed together people from different parts of the territory, who had no existing local or family loyalties to one another. An aristocrat from an inland estate would now find himself in the same tribe as a merchant from the city and a fisherman from the coast. Their old local power bases were rendered politically meaningless. Their new loyalty had to be to this new artificial construct, the tribe, and by extension, to the polis of Athens itself. It was a radical and brilliant piece of social surgery, designed to cut out the cancer of factionalism and create a new, unified body of citizens from this new tribal structure. The key institutions of the democracy flowed. The Council of 400, which Solon had created, was replaced by a new Council of 500. The Boule, this was the executive committee and steering group of the government. Each of the 10 new tribes would select, by lot, 50 of its citizens over the age of 30 to serve on the council for 1 year. This meant that the council was a true cross-section of the entire citizen body with representation from all parts of Attica. The use of the lot or sortition was a fundamental democratic principle. It was based on the belief that any citizen was capable of holding public office, and it was a powerful preventative against corruption and the formation of a permanent political class. The primary function of the Boule was to prepare the agenda for the assembly, to manage the state's finances, and to oversee the day-to-day administration of the city. It was, in essence, the engine room of the democracy. The supreme power in the state, however, rested with the assembly, the ecclesia, which was open to every single adult male citizen. The assembly met on a hill near the Acropolis called the Nix, a natural amphitheater-like space that could hold over 6,000 people. They would gather around 40 times a year to debate and vote on the most important issues facing the city. The agenda was set by the Boule, but any citizen had the right to stand up on the speaker's platform, the bema, and address the crowd. This was the principle of Isagoria, the equal right to speak. After the debate, the citizens would vote by a simple show of hands. The decisions made in the assembly were absolute. They could declare war, make peace, approve treaties, pass laws, and spend public money. This was direct democracy in its purest form. It was a system that placed an immense and unprecedented amount of trust and responsibility in the hands of the ordinary citizen. The fate of the city was not decided by a king or a council of elders, but by the collective wisdom or folly of several thousand farmers, artisans, and laborers gathered on a hillside dot to ensure the smooth day-to-day running of the government. The Boule of 500 was further organized by tribe. The year was divided into 10 prytanies, and for each prytany, the 50 council members from one of the 10 tribes would serve as the standing executive committee of the state. They lived and ate together at public expense in a special building, the Thylos, and were on call 24 hours a day. Each day a chairman was chosen by lot from among these 50 men. That man, for that single 24-hour period, was the acting head of state. He held the keys to the treasury and the state seal. With the exception of military command, he was the most powerful man in Athens. And the next day, it would be someone else. The system was designed to ensure that power was constantly rotated, that no one individual could ever accumulate too much of it. It is estimated that over the course of their lifetime, almost half of all Athenian citizens would have had the experience of serving on the Council of 500, a level of civic participation that is almost unimaginable today. Cleisthenes also introduced one of the most curious and fascinating mechanisms of the democracy, ostracism. Once a year, the citizens in the assembly could vote on whether to hold an ostracism. If they voted yes, a special day was set aside. The citizens would gather, and each man could write a name on a piece of broken pottery, an ostracon. If any one individual received a sufficient number of votes traditionally set at 6,000, that person was exiled from Athens for a period of 10 years. They did not lose their property, and their family was not harmed. At the end of the 10 years, they could return and resume their life as a citizen. Ostracism was not a punishment for a crime. It was a purely political tool, a preemptive strike. It was designed to defuse a political crisis by removing a citizen who was deemed to have become too powerful, too ambitious, or too divisive. It was a democratic safety valve, a way for the citizen body to remove a potential tyrant before he could seize power. It was a powerful and often ruthless weapon, a clear sign that in the Athenian democracy, the collective will of the people was ultimately superior to the ambition of any single individual. The final pillar of the Athenian democratic system was its radical judicial branch. In the age of Pericles, in the mid-5th century BCE, the power of the old aristocratic Areopagus court was dramatically reduced, and its judicial functions were transferred to the people's courts, the dicasteria. These were not courts with a single judge and a small jury of 12. An Athenian jury was a massive affair, composed of hundreds or even thousands of citizens, chosen by lot from a pool of 6,000 volunteers. A typical private case might have a jury of 501. A major public case could have a jury of 1,501 or more. There were no professional judges or lawyers. The plaintiffs and defendants argued their own cases, and the massive jury would vote on the verdict by a secret ballot, dropping bronze tokens into an urn. The decision of the jury was final and could not be appealed. This system placed an enormous amount of power in the hands of the ordinary citizen. It meant that every official, every general, and every politician was ultimately answerable to a jury of their peers. It was the ultimate check on the power of the elite to manage the complex process of selecting these thousands of jurors and other officials by lot. The Athenians developed a remarkable piece of technology, the cleriterion. This was a large stone allotment machine. The front of the stone slab was carved with a series of slots. Each citizen who was eligible for jury duty had a small bronze ticket, or panachion, with his name on it. At the beginning of the day, the citizens would place their tickets into the slots. A court official would then pour a number of black and white bronze dice into a funnel at the side of the machine. The dice would fall down a tube, and as they came out at the bottom one by one, they would determine whether the entire row of citizens corresponding to that die was selected for duty or not. A white die meant the whole row was selected. A black die meant they were all dismissed. It was a simple, elegant, and completely random way of selecting officials, a piece of democratic hardware designed to be incorruptible. The Clariterion is the physical embodiment of the Athenian, faith in the wisdom of the lot and the interchangeability of the citizen. The golden age of this radical democracy is inextricably linked with the figure of Pericles, who was the leading statesman of Athens from roughly 461 to 429 BCE. Pericles was an aristocrat by birth, but a democrat by conviction. Unusually, he was not chosen by lot. He was one of the 10 strategoi, or generals, an office that was elected annually because it was felt that military command required specific expertise that could not be left to chance. Pericles was re-elected to this position year after year, and he commanded such immense personal authority and respect that he was able to guide the city's policy through his powers of persuasion in the assembly. It was under his leadership that Athens embarked on the ambitious building program that created the Parthenon and the other magnificent structures of the Acropolis. In his famous funeral oration, a speech recorded by the historian Thucydides, Pericles gave the most eloquent and enduring defense of the Athenian democratic ideal. He praised a system where what mattered was not class but ability, and where citizens were expected to be actively engaged in the public life of their city. We do not say that a man who takes no interest in politics is a man who minds his own business, he declared. We say that he has no business here at all. This ideal of the active, engaged citizen was the moral core of the democracy. But it is crucial to remember that this people power applied only to a very specific and limited group of people. The citizen body of Athens consisted only of adult males who had been born to Athenian parents. This was a tiny minority of the total population of Attica. The vast majority of the inhabitants were completely excluded from the political process. The largest of these groups was the slaves. It is estimated that at its peak there may have been over 100,000 slaves in Attica, working in the silver mines, on the farms, and in the households. They were the engine of the Athenian economy, and their labor was what gave the male citizens the leisure time to participate in the assembly and the courts. These slaves had no rights. They were considered property, and their existence is the great, uncomfortable paradox at the heart of the Athenian democratic experiment. The freedom of the few was built upon the servitude of the many. Another major excluded group was women. Athenian women, even those of citizen birth, had no political rights. They could not vote, they could not attend the assembly, and they could not own property in their own name. Their lives were lived almost entirely in the private sphere of the household, the oikos. Their primary role was to manage the home, to raise the children, and, most importantly, to produce legitimate male heirs who could continue the citizen lineage. A respectable woman's life was one of seclusion, and she was expected to be neither seen nor heard in public. While there were undoubtedly strong and influential women within the private sphere, their contribution to the public political life of the city that is so celebrated was officially zero. The Athenian democracy was, in essence, a men's club. a brotherhood of citizens whose public freedom was made possible by the domestic labor of their wives and the physical labor of their slaves. The third major group excluded from citizenship was the metics, or resident foreigners. Athens, as a bustling commercial hub, was home to a large population of immigrants from other Greek city-states and from across the Mediterranean. These metics were free, and they played a vital role in the city's economy as merchants, bankers, artisans, and artists. They were required to pay taxes and to serve in the military, but they could not own land, and they could never become citizens. They lived in a state of permanent legal limbo, an essential part of the city's life, but forever excluded from its political core. This rigid and exclusive definition of citizenship is one of the key differences between the Athenian concept of democracy and our own. The modern liberal democratic ideal is one of universalism and inclusion. The Athenian ideal was one of particularity and exclusion. It was a democracy for a small, privileged group, who defined themselves in opposition to the slaves, women, and foreigners who lived among them. The Athenian system was not without its contemporary critics. The most brilliant of these was the philosopher Plato, a student of Socrates. Plato was deeply disillusioned with the democracy, particularly after its citizens voted to execute his master in 399 B.C. Plato was an intellectual aristocrat. He believed that governing was a skill, a science like medicine or navigation. In his great work, The Republic, he uses the famous analogy of the ship of state. If you were on a ship in a storm, he asks, who would you want to be in charge? A popular sailor who is good at winning over the crew, or the skilled navigator who actually understands the stars and the currents, even if he is grumpy and unpopular? The answer for Plato was obvious. He believed that the state should be ruled not by the ignorant masses, but by a special class of philosopher kings, individuals who had been rigorously trained from birth in matters of justice, reason, and the good. For Plato, democracy was little better than mob rule, a system that empowered the foolish and the short-sighted, and that would inevitably descend into chaos and tyranny. Plato's student, Aristotle, offered a more nuanced and scientific analysis of democracy. He collected and studied the constitutions of over 150 different Greek city-states, and in his work, Politics, he classified them into different types. He saw democracy as one of the three correct forms of government, the rule of the many, alongside monarchy, the rule of one, and aristocracy, the rule of the few. However, he also noted that each of these forms had a deviant or corrupt version. Monarchy could decay into tyranny, and aristocracy could decay into oligarchy. The deviant form of democracy, he argued, was mob rule, where the poor would use their numerical superiority to expropriate the rich, leading to instability and class warfare. Aristotle favored a polity, a mixed constitution that blended elements of democracy and oligarchy, and where power rested with a large and stable middle class. His careful comparative analysis was the birth of political science, and his concerns about the potential for democratic instability have been echoed by political thinkers for millennia. The golden age of Athenian democracy was ultimately short-lived. The very system that had empowered Athens also fueled its hubris and its imperial ambitions. The Peloponnesian War against Sparta was a catastrophe from which Athens never fully recovered. The assembly, swayed by charismatic but reckless speakers known as demagogues, made a series of disastrous strategic decisions, most notably the ill-fated Sicilian expedition. The war exposed the weaknesses of the democratic system, its susceptibility to emotional appeals, its lack of consistent long-term strategy, and its tendency towards factionalism, even in the face of an existential threat. Although the democracy was restored after the war, Athens's power was broken. A century later, Athens, along with the rest of the Greek city-states, fell under the domination of Philip II of Macedon and his son, Alexander the Great. The age of the independent, self-governing polis was over. The Athenian democratic experiment had come to an end, its flame extinguished, not to be relit for nearly 2,000 years. So what? Then is the modern echo of this brief, brilliant, and deeply flawed experiment. It is, first and foremost, in the very words we use to describe our political lives. Democracy, politics, republic, monarchy, oligarchy, tyranny. This is the vocabulary that the Greeks, and particularly the Athenians, invented to make sense of the human social world. Even the word idiot has its roots in Athenian democracy. It comes from the Greek idios, which referred to a private citizen, a man who took no interest in public affairs. To the Athenians, such a person was not just minding their own business. They were a useless and deficient member of the community. This reveals the profound cultural shift that the democracy had created, a new ideal of the active, informed, and engaged citizen as the cornerstone of a healthy state. This ideal, the belief in a government of the people, by the people, for the people, is the most direct and powerful legacy of ancient Athens. The institutional echoes are all around us. The modern legislature, whether it is a parliament or a congress, is the direct descendant of the Athenian ecclesia, a dedicated body where citizens' representatives gather to debate and vote on the laws of the land. The concept of the citizen jury, the idea that a person's fate should be decided by a jury of their peers, is an echo of the massive dicasteria. While our juries are much smaller, the fundamental principle of citizen justice is a direct inheritance. The very architecture of our civic spaces, the amphitheater style, seating of a lecture hall or a legislative chamber, is designed to facilitate public speaking and debate. A physical echo of the Nix Hill where the Athenian citizens once gathered. Our concepts of civic duty, of the separation of powers, and of the accountability of public officials to the people they serve, all have their roots in the systems and struggles of 5th century BCE Athens. But perhaps the most profound echo is not in the institutions themselves, but in the ongoing conversation and the unresolved debates that the Athenians started. The fundamental tensions that they were the first to grapple with are the same tensions that define our political lives today. What is the proper balance between the will of the majority and the rights of the minority? How do we balance the ideal of citizen participation with the need for specialized expertise in a complex world? How do we protect our democracies from the dangers of demagoguery and mob rule? How do we define who is and who is not a citizen? And what rights and responsibilities does that entail? These are the questions that were debated on the Nix, in the dialogues of Plato, and in the treatises of Aristotle. When we engage in modern political debate, we are, whether we know it or not, participating in a 2-and-a-half-thousand-year-old conversation. The Athenian experiment may have failed in its original form, but the questions it raised and the radical ideal it proposed have never ceased to shape our world. It was the first audacious draft of the democratic ideal, a blueprint that we are still trying to perfect to this day. If the Athenian gift to the world was a radical, brilliant, but ultimately fragile idea, the ideal of democracy, then our next journey takes us to a civilization that excelled not in the creation of abstract ideals, but in their pragmatic and systematic application. We travel to the heart of Italy, to the sprawling, noisy, and relentlessly practical city of Rome. The Romans were not, by their own admission, great original philosophers. They were engineers, soldiers, and above all, administrators. Their unique genius was for creating systems of roads, systems of military organization, and most enduringly, a system of law. The Romans took the Greek philosophical inquiry into the nature of justice and transformed it into a vast and sophisticated technology for governing a diverse, multi-ethnic, continent-spanning empire. Roman law was the invisible software that ran the hardware of the Roman state. It was a system designed to be stable, predictable, and adaptable, capable of resolving disputes not just between Roman citizens, but between all the myriad peoples who lived under their rule. The echo of this Roman legal framework is arguably the most profound and deeply embedded of all ancient legacies. It is in the very language of our courts, the structure of our legal codes, and the fundamental belief that a government of laws and not of men is the ultimate guarantor of civilization. The story of Roman law, like that of Athens, begins not with a philosophical treatise, but with a social crisis. In the early days of the Roman Republic, in the 5th century BCE, the legal system was almost entirely in the hands of the patricians, the small aristocratic class who dominated the state. The law itself was a mixture of unwritten religious custom and oral tradition, its interpretation and application a secret, closely guarded privilege of the patrician priests, the pontifices. For the plebeians, the vast majority of the Roman citizen body, this system was opaque, arbitrary, and deeply unjust. They had no way of knowing what the law actually was, and they were entirely at the mercy of the patrician magistrates who dispensed it. This legal inequality was a major source of the long and bitter social struggle known as the conflict of the orders, a struggle by the plebeians for political and legal equality. One of their most fundamental demands was simple and revolutionary, that the law be written down and made public for all to see. This demand was finally met around the year 450 BCE, with the creation of the Law of the 12 Tables. According to tradition, a special commission of 10 men, the decemviri, was appointed to draft a code of laws that would be binding on both patricians and plebeians. They are said to have sent a delegation to the Greek cities of southern Italy to study their legal systems, including the laws of Solon. The result was a set of 12 bronze tablets, which were erected in the Roman Forum, the heart of the city's public life. The original tablets have long since vanished, but their contents were so foundational that they were memorized by Roman schoolboys for centuries, and fragments and quotations survive in the works of later Roman writers. The 12 Tables were not a comprehensive constitution in the modern sense. They were a collection of specific, often harsh, legal provisions covering matters of property, debt, family law, and religious observance. The infamous law on debt, for instance, supposedly allowed creditors to cut up the body of a defaulting debtor and divide the pieces among themselves, though it is more likely this was a symbolic provision. Despite their severity, the 12 tables represented a monumental victory for the plebeians and a pivotal moment in the history of Western law. Their importance was not in their specific content, but in their very existence. By being written down and publicly displayed, the law was transformed from a secret instrument of aristocratic power into a common public possession. It was now, in theory, knowable, predictable, and applicable to all citizens equally. The tablets established the principle that a citizen's rights and duties were not subject to the arbitrary whims of a magistrate, but were defined by a written code that could be consulted and debated. While the patricians still held most of the power to interpret and apply the law, the first and most crucial step had been taken. The law was no longer a mystery. It was a text. The Roman historian Livy called the 12 tables the fons omnis publici privatique iuris, the fountainhead of all public and private law. They were the bedrock upon which the entire vast edifice of Roman legal science would be built. As the Roman Republic grew in size and complexity, its legal system had to evolve. A simple code of rules was no longer sufficient to deal with the endless variety of disputes that arose in a bustling commercial society. This evolution was driven not by the legislature, but by the magistrates who were responsible for administering justice. The key figure in this process was the praetor. The office of praetor was created in the 4th century BCE to serve as the chief judicial officer of the state. Each year, upon taking office, the praetor would issue an edict, a public proclamation outlining the legal principles and remedies he would apply during his term. A new praetor would typically adopt the edict of his predecessor and then add to it or modify it based on new circumstances and his own sense of fairness. This Praetorian edict became a living, breathing source of law. It was a way for the legal system to adapt and grow without having to constantly pass new legislation. The praetors were not creating law out of thin air. They were creating new legal remedies, new ways for citizens to bring a case and seek justice. Over the centuries, this evolving body of Praetorian law became a vast and flexible system that was far more important in the daily life of a Roman than the ancient and often obsolete provisions of the 12 tables. The genius of the Roman legal mind lay in its ability to abstract general principles from specific cases. As the praetors and judges dealt with thousands of individual disputes, they began to develop a new and uniquely Roman science, jurisprudence. This was the systematic study of the law, the attempt to understand its underlying principles and to organize it into a coherent and rational system. This work was not done by government officials, but by a class of private, highly respected legal experts, the jurists. These were men, often from the upper classes, who devoted their lives to the study and interpretation of the law. They were the first true lawyers. They gave legal advice to their fellow citizens. They assisted the praetors in drafting their edicts, and most importantly, they wrote extensive treatises on the law. In these writings, they analyzed complex legal problems, debated the meaning of statutes, and developed the fundamental concepts and categories that still form the basis of Western legal thought. They were the ones who first clearly articulated the distinctions between public law and private law, between property, contract, and tort, and between substance and procedure. One of the most important concepts developed by the jurists was the idea of equitas, or equity. They recognized that the strict and literal application of a law could sometimes lead to a result that was manifestly unfair. Equity was the principle that the spirit of the law was more important than its letter. It was a way for a judge or a praetor to mitigate the harshness of the formal law and to arrive at a just and common-sense solution. This concept was deeply influenced by Greek philosophy, particularly the Stoic idea of a universal, natural law based on reason. The Roman jurists began to believe that their legal system should strive to align itself with this higher natural law. This gave them the intellectual confidence to move beyond simple interpretation and to actively shape the law in the pursuit of justice. The development of equity made the Roman legal system incredibly flexible and adaptable, allowing it to remain relevant for centuries and to be applied to a wide variety of different cultures and situations. It was the system's built-in mechanism for self-correction and moral growth. This adaptability was put to its greatest test as Rome expanded from a small Italian city-state into a vast Mediterranean empire. The traditional Roman civil law, the jus civili, applied only to Roman citizens. But the empire was now filled with millions of non-citizens Greeks, Egyptians, Gauls, Syrians, all with their own local customs and legal traditions. To deal with the inevitable disputes that arose between these peoples and between them and Roman citizens, the Romans developed a new and revolutionary body of law, the jus gentium, or law of nations. This was a system of law that was believed to be common to all peoples, based on principles of natural reason and fairness that any rational person could understand. It was a kind of universal, common-sense law stripped of the peculiar formalities of Roman civil law. The jus gentium governed matters of commerce, trade, and property among all the inhabitants of the empire, regardless of their citizenship. It was an incredibly pragmatic and tolerant system, one that allowed the Romans to govern a multi-ethnic empire without having to impose their own specific legal code on every conquered people. The administration of the jus gentium fell to a special new magistrate, the praetor peregrinus, or praetor for foreigners. This praetor's court became a great laboratory for legal innovation, dealing with merchants and traders from every corner of the Mediterranean. The peregrine praetor had to develop a new set of legal principles for commercial transactions that were simple, efficient, and universally applicable. It was in this court that many of the foundational principles of modern commercial law were first developed, including the law of contracts. The Romans developed a sophisticated theory of contracts based on the principle of consensus or mutual agreement. They categorized different types of contract: sale, lease, partnership, mandate, and defined the rights and duties of each party. This creation of a predictable, reliable, and fair legal framework for commerce was one of Rome's greatest gifts to the world. It was the legal software that enabled the vast, integrated economy of the Roman Empire to function, creating a single market that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. The Roman legal process itself was a complex, two-stage affair that clearly separated the legal issues from the factual ones. When a citizen wished to bring a lawsuit, he would first go before the praetor. This first stage, known as inure, was a formal hearing where the praetor would determine the precise legal issue at the heart of the dispute. Working with the jurists, he would frame the case in the form of a formula, a precise set of legal instructions. This formula was essentially a hypothetical statement. If you, the judge, find that fact X is true, then you must order the defendant to pay Y. Once this legal framework was established, the case was handed over to a second figure, the iudix, for the second stage of the trial, known as apud iudicem. The iudix was not a professional judge, but a respected private citizen chosen by the parties to the dispute. His job was simply to hear the evidence, the testimony of witnesses, the presentation of documents, and to determine the facts of the case. He would then apply the facts to the formula given to him by the praetor and issue a verdict. This elegant two-stage system separated the expert legal work from the common-sense task of fact-finding, and it became a model for the later distinction between the judge and the jury. In common law systems, one of the areas where Roman law was most detailed and sophisticated was in the law of property. The jurists developed a highly refined understanding of the concept of ownership, or dominium, which they saw as the absolute right to use, enjoy, and dispose of a piece of property. They made clear distinctions between ownership, possession, and servitudes, like a right-of-way over someone else's land. They developed complex rules for the transfer of property through formal conveyance, sale, or inheritance. The Roman law of wills and testaments was particularly elaborate, allowing a citizen to dispose of his property after death with a great deal of freedom and precision. This creation of a secure and predictable system of property rights was another essential pillar of the Roman economy. It gave individuals the confidence to invest, to improve their land, and to engage in long-term commercial enterprises, knowing that their ownership rights were protected by the full force of the state. Many of the fundamental concepts in our modern property law are a direct inheritance from the categories and principles first worked out by the Roman jurists. Roman family law, however, reveals a side of their society that is far more alien to our modern sensibilities. The Roman family was built upon the principle of patria potestas, the power of the father. The head of a Roman family, the paterfamilias, held absolute life or death power over all the members of his household, including his wife, his children, no matter their age, his adopted children, his slaves, and even his adult sons and their families. Legally, only the paterfamilias could own property. Anything his children or slaves acquired was legally his. He had the right to arrange their marriages, to sell them into slavery, and even in the early republic, to put them to death. While this power was tempered by custom and public opinion, it remained a legal reality for centuries. Roman marriage law also reflected a deeply patriarchal society, with the wife passing from the control of her father to the control of her husband. This ancient hierarchical structure of the Roman family stands in stark contrast to the modern, individualistic focus of our own family law. And it is a powerful reminder that the Roman world, for all its legal sophistication, was a profoundly different moral universe. As the centuries passed, the body of Roman law grew into a vast and unwieldy mass. The praetors' edicts, the statutes passed by the Senate, the decrees of the emperors, and the voluminous writings of the jurists formed a complex and often contradictory legal jungle. By the late Roman Empire, there was a pressing need for systematization and codification. The first great attempt at this was the Theodosian Code, promulgated by the Emperor Theodosius II in 438 CE. This was a massive collection of all the imperial laws issued since the time of Constantine. But the most important and influential codification came a century later in the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, Empire. The Emperor Justinian I, who reigned from 527 to 565 CE, harbored a grand ambition to restore the former glory of the Roman Empire, not just through military conquest, but through a restoration of its legal heritage. He appointed a commission of jurists, led by the brilliant legal scholar Tribonian, to undertake the monumental task of collecting, editing, and systematizing the entire history of Roman law. The result of their labors, produced in an astonishingly short period of time, is known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. This massive work consisted of 4 parts. The first was a Codex Justinianus, an updated and streamlined collection of all the imperial laws. The second and most intellectually important part was the Digest or Pandex. This was a vast anthology of the writings of the great Roman jurists of the classical age. Tribonian's team sifted through over 2,000 books of legal commentary, extracting the most important principles and organizing them by topic. The Digest is a treasure trove of Roman legal science, a snapshot of the Roman legal mind at its most sophisticated. The third part was the Institutes, a concise and systematic textbook for first-year law students, which provided a clear and logical overview of the entire system. And the final part was the Novellae, a collection of the new laws issued by Justinian himself. The Corpus Juris Civilis was one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements of antiquity, a grand synthesis of 1,000 years of legal thought and practice. The immediate impact of Justinian's code in the Western Roman Empire, which had by then collapsed, was limited. However, in the 11th century CE, a complete manuscript of the Digest was rediscovered in a library in Italy, likely in Pisa. This rediscovery had an effect on the intellectual life of Europe that can only be described as explosive. At the newly founded universities, particularly at the University of Bologna, scholars began to study the Corpus Juris Civilis with a fervent and scientific intensity. They were astonished by its sophistication, its rationalism, and its comprehensive scope. It seemed to them to be written reason itself. A school of legal scholars known as the glossators began to study the text, writing detailed commentaries and explanations, or glosses, in the margins. Their work, and that of the generations of scholars who followed them, revived Roman law and made it the foundation of a new, common European legal tradition, the Jus Commune. This revived Roman law became the basis for the legal systems of most of continental Europe. The great national law codes of the 19th century, such as the Napoleonic Code in France and the German civil code were fundamentally acts of modernizing and systematizing the principles of Roman law that had been studied in European universities for centuries. This is why the legal systems of countries like France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and most of Latin America are today referred to as civil law jurisdictions. Their legal tradition is one of comprehensive, written codes that are rooted in the logical, systematic structure of Justinian's great compilation. The echo of Rome is explicit and direct in these systems. Even in the common law jurisdictions of England and its former colonies, including the United States, the influence of Roman law is profound, though more subtle. While the common law developed its own unique traditions based on judicial precedent, many of its foundational concepts of property, contract, and tort were deeply influenced by the study of Roman law in English universities and by the principles of equity, which were themselves a Roman invention. The modern legal profession is another direct echo of the Roman world. The figure of the jurist, the private expert who devotes his life to the study and interpretation of the law, is the clear ancestor of the modern lawyer, law professor, and judge. The curriculum of a modern law school, with its focus on the careful analysis of texts and the application of general principles to specific factual situations, is a continuation of the intellectual project begun by the jurists of ancient Rome. The very language of the law is saturated with Latin terms that have been in continuous use for 2,000 years. Habeas corpus, pro bono, caveat emptor, affidavit, subpoena. Each of these terms is a tiny linguistic fossil, a verbal echo that connects the daily practice of a modern courtroom directly back to the world of the Roman Forum. But the most fundamental and enduring legacy of the Roman legal framework is not in the specific rules or the Latin terminology. It is in the very idea of the rule of law itself. It is the belief that a society should be governed by a system of rational, predictable, and publicly known laws, not by the arbitrary power of an individual. It is the principle that all citizens are subject to the law, and that the law should be applied equally and impartially. It is the conviction that the purpose of the state is to provide a framework of justice within which its citizens can resolve their disputes peacefully and conduct their affairs with confidence. This idea, which the Romans inherited in part from the Greeks, but then developed into a powerful and enduring system, is arguably the most important technology of governance ever invented. It is the essential software that makes complex, free, and stable societies possible. It is the great wall that stands between civilization and barbarism, between order and chaos. The Romans were not a nation of saints. Their history is filled with brutality, conquest, and injustice. Their legal system sanctioned the horrors of slavery and the absolute power of the paterfamilias. And in the late empire, the emperor himself became the ultimate source of law, standing above it in a way that the early jurists would not have recognized. But despite all its flaws and contradictions, the system they built was, and remains, a monumental achievement of the human intellect. It was the product of 1,000 years of patient, practical, and rational thought, a collective effort by generations of magistrates and jurists to build a better, more orderly world. They were the first to truly believe that the administration of a state could be a science, and that justice could be based on a set of logical and coherent principles. And so, The echo of the Roman praetor and the Roman jurist is all around us. It is in the structure of our international commercial contracts, which allow the global economy to function. It is in the legal codes that govern our daily lives, from buying a house to writing a will. It is in the quiet, scholarly work of the law professor and in the dramatic arguments of the trial lawyer. But most of all, it is in the quiet confidence we have that our disputes will be settled not by violence, but by a process of rational argument and impartial judgment under a system of laws that is common to us all. This confidence, this fundamental belief in a government of laws, is the most precious and enduring part of the inheritance that we have received from the pragmatic and systematic genius of ancient Rome. It is the invisible legal architecture that quietly and constantly structures our modern world. If Roman law was the invisible software that ran the empire, then Roman engineering was its magnificent, brutally effective hardware. While the Greeks had excelled in the aesthetics of form and proportion, creating temples of sublime but static beauty, the Romans were at their core builders, problem-solvers, and masters of infrastructure on a scale the world had never before conceived. Their genius lay not in philosophical abstraction, but in the pragmatic application of scientific principles to the challenges of the real world. They sought to dominate and order their physical environment with the same systematic ambition they applied to their laws. This was the civilization that truly paved the world, that moved rivers, and that created artificial mountains of stone and concrete for the entertainment of the masses. To walk through the ruins of the Roman Empire today is to be humbled by the sheer audacity and permanence of their engineering vision. The echo of that vision is not just in the surviving monuments. It is in the very blueprint of our modern urban world and our highways, our water systems, and the very materials we use to build our cities. This is the story of how Rome built the world's first global infrastructure, the secret ingredient at the heart of Rome's architectural revolution. The material that allowed them to leap beyond the post and lintel limitations of the Greeks and to build on a colossal scale was a substance of their own invention, Roman hydraulic concrete, or opus caementitium. This was not simply a mixture of mortar and gravel. It was a sophisticated composite material, the product of a remarkable chemical discovery. The Romans found that by mixing a volcanic ash, which was abundant in the regions around Naples and Rome, with lime, they created a mortar that was exceptionally strong. But its truly revolutionary property was that it could set and harden even under water. This volcanic ash, which we now call pozzolana after the town of Pozzuoli, where it was first identified, contains silica and alumina. When mixed with lime and water, it undergoes a complex chemical reaction, forming a crystalline structure that is incredibly strong, durable, and resistant to water. This was a technological breakthrough of immense significance. The Romans exploited this discovery with characteristic pragmatism and efficiency. They realized that this powerful pozzolanic mortar could be used not just to join stones, but as the main ingredient in a new form of mass construction. A Roman wall or vault was not typically a solid block of masonry. It was a kind of sandwich. The builders would first construct two thin, retaining walls of brick or shaped stone, creating a hollow cavity between them. Into this cavity, they would dump a wet, soupy mixture of the hydraulic mortar and an aggregate of broken stones, rubble and recycled building materials known as the commenta. This mixture would then cure into a single, solid, monolithic mass, as strong and as permanent as solid rock, but vastly cheaper and faster to produce. This was a revolutionary construction technique. It did not require armies of highly skilled stone carvers like a Greek temple did. It could be done by a relatively unskilled labor force, supervised by a few knowledgeable engineers. It was a technology of mass production, perfectly suited to the scale of their imperial ambitions. It allowed them to build bigger, faster, and stronger than any civilization before them. The most spectacular and enduring testament to the power of Roman concrete is the Pantheon in Rome, the temple dedicated to all the gods. Built by the Emperor Hadrian around 126 CE, its most breathtaking feature is its colossal, unreinforced concrete dome, which remains, nearly 2,000 years later, the largest of its kind in the world. The dome is a perfect hemisphere, spanning an incredible 43.3 meters, or 142 feet, in diameter. It is a work of pure engineering genius. The Roman architects understood the immense stresses involved and designed the dome with a sophisticated, weight-saving structure. The aggregate used in the concrete mixture was carefully chosen. Heavy basalt was used in the foundations, while lighter materials like tufa and porous pumice were used in the upper sections of the dome. The dome's thickness was also tapered, from over 6 meters thick at its base to just over 1 meter thick at its crown. The interior of the dome is coffered, divided into a series of recessed square panels that not only serve a decorative purpose, but also reduce the dome's overall weight without compromising its structural integrity. At the very apex is the famous oculus, a 9-meter-wide opening to the sky, which further lightens the load at the dome's weakest point and creates a dramatic, moving shaft of light within the temple. The Pantheon is the ultimate expression of the Roman mastery of space, light, and material, a building that still feels profoundly modern in its audacious engineering. This mastery of concrete, combined with their perfection of the arch, the vault, and the dome, allowed the Romans to create a whole new architectural language of enclosure and interior space. While Greek architecture was primarily an architecture of the exterior, designed to be admired from the outside, Roman architecture was an architecture of experience, designed to enclose, impress, and manage vast numbers of people. This is nowhere more evident than in the great public bathhouses or thermae. These were not simply places to get clean. They were colossal, state-sponsored leisure complexes, the social and recreational heart of the Roman city. Structures like the baths of Caracalla in Rome could accommodate thousands of people at a time and contained a vast and complex sequence of rooms, changing rooms, apodyteria, hot rooms, caldaria, warm rooms, tepidaria, and cold plunge pools, frigidaria. They also included libraries, art galleries, gardens, and gymnasia. All of this was made possible by the Roman engineers' ability to span vast interior spaces with massive concrete, groin vaults, and to heat these spaces using a sophisticated system of underfloor heating known as a hypocaust. The thermae were a stunning demonstration of the state's ability to provide for its citizens, a masterpiece of social engineering as much as structural engineering, The most infamous of all Roman structures, the Flavian Amphitheater or the Colosseum, is another monument to the power of the arch and the efficiency of concrete construction. Completed in 80 CE, it was the largest amphitheater in the Roman world, a massive elliptical structure that could hold over 50,000 spectators. Its exterior facade is a masterpiece of classical design, a stack of 3 tiers of open arches, framed by columns of the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders, a clear nod to their Greek architectural inheritance. But the real genius of the Colosseum was its internal structure and its crowd control logistics. The entire building is a complex honeycomb network of concrete barrel vaults and radial walls, creating a system of corridors and staircases, the vomitoria that could allow the entire massive crowd to enter and find their seats within minutes. A feat of crowd management that modern stadium designers still admire. Below the wooden arena floor was the hypogeum, an incredibly complex 2-story subterranean network of tunnels, cages, and elevators, from which gladiators, condemned prisoners, and exotic animals from across the empire could be suddenly lifted onto the arena floor to meet their fate. The Colosseum was a brutal, terrifying, and highly sophisticated machine for mass entertainment and mass death, a perfect and chilling expression of Roman power and engineering prowess. While concrete and the arch allowed the Romans to shape their cities, it was another great technology that gave those cities life, the aqueduct. A great Roman city, with its baths, its fountains, and its dense population, had a voracious and insatiable thirst for water. To satisfy this need, Roman engineers performed one of their most remarkable and visually stunning feats. They moved rivers. The aqueducts were artificial channels that brought vast quantities of fresh water from distant mountain springs into the heart of the city, flowing entirely by the power of gravity. This required an almost unbelievable level of precision in surveying. Roman engineers, using simple tools like the corybates, a long wooden level, and the groma, a surveying cross, were able to plot the course of an aqueduct over dozens of miles, maintaining a steady, gentle, downward gradient of only a few feet per mile. The aqueduct was not, as is often imagined, a continuous bridge of arches. The vast majority of its length was a simple, covered, stone-lined channel, running just below the ground surface, or on a low wall. The iconic, towering arched bridges were a solution of last resort, used only when the channel had to cross a deep valley or a river. But what a solution they were! Structures like the Pont du Gard in southern France, a 3-tiered bridge of arches that soars nearly 50 meters above the Garden River, are among the most beautiful and elegant works of civil engineering ever created. They are a perfect fusion of form and function, their graceful arches a testament to the Roman engineer's intuitive understanding of structural forces. An aqueduct like the Aqua Marcia, which supplied Rome, was over 91 kilometers long and could deliver nearly 187 million liters of pure, fresh water to the city every single day. This vast supply of water was not just a luxury. It was the essential foundation of Roman urban life, a technology that enabled a level of public health and sanitation that would not be seen again in Europe until the 19th century. Once the water arrived in the city, it was channeled into a complex distribution system. It first entered a large distribution tank, or castellum aquae, from which it was then piped, through a network of lead pipes, or fistulae, to the public baths, the public fountains, from which the poor drew their water, and for a hefty fee to the private villas of the wealthy. The Romans also developed a sophisticated system for removing waste water. An extensive network of underground sewers, the cloaca, ran beneath the city streets, carrying storm runoff and waste from the baths and public latrines out of the city and into the nearest river. The most famous of these, the Cloaca Maxima in Rome, was originally an open drain that was later covered over and vaulted, a testament to the longevity and scale of Roman hydraulic engineering. This combination of a constant fresh water supply and an effective sewer system was the key to sustaining the unprecedented population density of a city like Rome, which at its peak was home to over 1 million people. If the aqueducts were the arteries of the Roman city, then the Roman roads were the arteries of the empire itself. The Romans were the greatest road builders of the ancient world, and their vast, continent-spanning network was a masterpiece of strategic and logistical engineering. The famous saying, "All roads lead to Rome," was a literal truth. The primary purpose of the road system was military. It was designed to allow the Roman legions to move swiftly and reliably from one province to another, to quell rebellions, and to defend the frontiers. But the roads quickly became the essential infrastructure for commerce, communication, and the administration of the empire. The cursus publicus, the state-run postal and transport service, used the road network to carry official mail, tax revenues, and government officials from Britain to Syria with unprecedented speed and efficiency. The roads were the great unifiers, the physical bonds that tied the vast and diverse empire into a single, interconnected entity. A Roman road was not a simple dirt track. It was a sophisticated, multi-layered structure, built to last for centuries. The process of construction was a major engineering undertaking. First, Roman surveyors would plot the straightest and most practical course, often sighting from one hilltop to the next. The legionary soldiers, who were as much builders as they were fighters, would then excavate a wide trench, the fossa. At the bottom of this trench they would lay a foundation of large, compacted stones, the stadamen. Above this came a layer of smaller stones mixed with gravel or sand, the rudis, followed by a layer of concrete mixed with gravel, the nucleus. The final paved surface, the summa crusta, was made of large, polygonal, tightly fitted blocks of hard stone, like basalt or granite, carefully sloped to allow for drainage. The roads were built with drainage ditches on either side and were regularly marked with milestones or milliaria, which indicated the distance to the next major town and often bore the name of the emperor who had built or repaired that section of the road. It was a system built for permanence and efficiency, an empire-wide project of a scale and quality that would not be matched again. Until the age of the railway, the Romans applied their engineering skills not only to grand civic projects, but also to the industrial-scale exploitation of natural resources. Their mining operations, particularly for valuable metals like gold, silver, and lead, were vast and often terrifying in their scale and ingenuity. In places like the gold mines of Las Medulas in northwestern Spain, they employed a spectacular and incredibly destructive technique known as ruinamontium, or the wrecking of the mountains. Engineers would first drive a complex network of narrow galleries and shafts deep into a mountainside, following the gold-bearing alluvial deposits. They would then build aqueducts to bring vast quantities of water to reservoirs built on top of the mountain. When the reservoirs were full, the sluice gates were opened, and a massive torrent of water would be unleashed into the mine shafts. The hydraulic pressure of the water would explode the mountain from the inside out, washing away millions of tons of earth and revealing the gold deposits, which were then collected in a series of downstream sluicing channels. The resulting landscape at Las Medulas is a surreal man-made canyon, a stark and monumental scar on the earth that bears silent witness to the Roman thirst for gold and the brutal efficiency of their industrial engineering. This vast infrastructure of cities, roads, and mines was built and maintained by the Roman army. The Roman legionary was the most effective and disciplined fighting man in the ancient world, but his job did not end with the battle. In times of peace, the legions were the empire's primary construction force. An inscription from Hadrian's Wall in Britain proudly records that a particular section was built by the soldiers of the Second Augustan Legion. The legionaries' standard kit included not just a sword, a shield, and a javelin, but also a shovel, a pickaxe, and a wicker basket for carrying earth. The discipline, organization, and engineering skill of the army were the engine that drove the physical expansion and consolidation of the empire. Every legion had its own contingent of specialist surveyors, engineers, architects, stonemasons, and the regular soldiers provided the raw, disciplined manpower. The Roman army did not just conquer the world. It actively built the world it conquered, leaving a legacy of roads, bridges, forts, and cities in its wake. The modern echo of this Roman engineering genius is so deeply embedded in our Western world that it is often invisible to us. The most direct legacy is in the very layout of our cities. Many of the great cities of Europe, from London, Londinium, and Paris, Lutetia, to Cologne, Colonia Agrippina, and Vienna, Vindobona, began their lives as Roman military camps or colonial settlements. Their characteristic grid plan of streets, with a central north-south axis, the Cardo, and an east-west axis, the Decumanus, can still be traced in the street maps of these modern metropolises. The Roman penchant for imposing a rational, geometric order on the landscape is an idea that has been inherited by city planners for millennia, most famously in the grid plan of most American cities. The Roman city, with its clear distinction between public and private space, its provision of public amenities, and its underlying infrastructure of water and sanitation, was the prototype for all subsequent Western urbanism. Our modern infrastructure is another clear descendant of Roman precedents. The vast, federally funded highway systems of the 20th century, like the American interstate system or the German Autobahn, are the modern equivalent of the Roman road network. They are strategic, state-sponsored projects designed to facilitate the rapid movement of goods, armies, and information across a vast continental territory. The engineering challenges are different, but their fundamental purpose, to bind a nation together and to project its economic and military power, is identical. Similarly, the great civil engineering projects that brought clean water to our modern cities in the 19th and 20th centuries were explicitly inspired by Roman models. The engineers who built the aqueducts that still supply cities like New York and Los Angeles saw themselves as the direct inheritors of the Roman tradition. Applying modern technology to the same ancient problem of urban hydrology, the materials we build with are also a Roman legacy. Concrete, after being lost to the world for over a millennium following the fall of the empire, was reinvented in the 18th century and became the essential material of the modern architectural age. Our skyscrapers, our bridges, our dams, our entire built environment is, in a very real sense, a product of this rediscovered Roman technology. The modern use of prefabricated components and the division of labor on a large construction site are also practices that were pioneered on Roman building projects. The Roman emphasis on practicality, durability, and the systematic application of engineering principles remains the guiding ethos of the modern civil engineering profession. Every time a modern engineer calculates the load-bearing capacity of an arch or designs a drainage system, they are participating in a conversation that was started by their Roman predecessors 2,000 years ago. Even the tools of the Roman engineer have their echoes in our world. While their instruments were simple, the principles upon which they operated are timeless. The chorobates, the Roman level, worked on the simple principle that water will always find a level surface. The modern spirit level and the sophisticated laser levels used on construction sites today are merely high-tech applications of the same fundamental physical principle. The Roman use of the crane, or polyspastos, powered by human treadmills, to lift heavy stone blocks was a remarkable piece of mechanical engineering that allowed them to build on a vertical scale. It is the direct ancestor of the towering cranes that dominate the skyline of any modern city under construction. The Roman engineer was a master of applied physics, a pragmatist who used a deep, intuitive understanding of geometry, mechanics, and hydraulics to solve real-world problems. However, like all technologies, the Roman engineering legacy has a darker side. The Roman desire to dominate and exploit the natural world, to move mountains and divert rivers for their own purposes, can be seen as the origin of a particularly Western attitude towards the environment. The destructive scale of their mining operations and the massive consumption of timber required to fuel their baths and their forges had a significant and lasting impact on the Mediterranean landscape. This idea of nature as a resource to be conquered and exploited for human benefit, while a source of immense technological progress, has also led to some of the most profound ecological challenges of our own time. In the monumental scars left by the Roman miners at Las Medulas, we can see a premonition of the environmental costs of our own industrial ambition. In the end, the physical infrastructure of the Roman Empire outlasted the empire itself. Long after the legions had vanished and the emperors were a distant memory, the roads, the bridges, and the aqueducts remained. They were the enduring skeleton of a lost world. For the people of the early Middle Ages, these vast and often incomprehensible ruins were the work of giants or of demons. But they were also a constant and powerful reminder of a lost age of unity, order, and technological prowess. The dream of Rome, the ideal of a peaceful, prosperous, and unified world connected by a common infrastructure and a common law, never entirely disappeared. It was a dream that would haunt the imagination of European rulers for centuries, from Charlemagne to Napoleon, and it is a dream that finds its modern echo in our own aspirations for a global, interconnected community. And so, the next time you drive on a major highway, or turn on a tap to get a drink of clean water, or walk through the downtown core of a great city, take a moment to remember the Roman engineers. Remember the surveyors standing on a distant hilltop, plotting the unswerving course of a new road. Remember the legionaries digging the foundations of a bridge in a foreign land. And remember the architects calculating the stresses on a vast concrete dome. We live today in a world that they, in a very real and tangible sense, helped to build. Their practical, ambitious, and enduring genius for ordering the physical world is one of the most powerful and visible echoes of the past in our modern lives. They left behind a blueprint for civilization that we are still building on to this day. Our journey through the echoes of the past is at its end. We have traveled from the clay plains of Sumer to the marble heart of the Roman Forum and the bustling agora of Athens. We have sought the origins of the invisible architecture that structures our world, and we have found that the blueprints for our most modern creations are, in fact, astonishingly ancient. The world we inhabit, which feels so new, so firmly a product of our own time, is in fact a house built upon the foundations of these distant civilizations. Their voices were never silenced. We simply learned to stop listening. But if we quiet the noise of the present for just a moment, we can hear their echoes everywhere. We began our journey where civilization first learned to speak to itself across time. In Mesopotamia, we discovered that the entire edifice of our information age, from the humble book to the global internet, rests upon a foundation of baked clay. The Sumerian scribe, with his simple stylus and tablet, was not just an accountant tallying sheep. He was the pioneer of a cognitive revolution. In his wedge-shaped marks, he gave humanity a collective memory, a way to accumulate knowledge beyond the lifespan of a single individual. The technology he invented was the software that would enable law, literature, history, and science. It was the first and perhaps greatest step in the human quest to transcend our own mortality. We then journeyed to Greece, to the brilliant, quarrelsome city of Athens, and found the birthplace of two new technologies of the mind. In the assembly we witnessed the birth of the radical and audacious idea that a people could govern themselves, the democratic ideal. And in the marketplace we listened to the relentless questioning of Socrates and his successors, who gave us the tools of philosophy and rational inquiry. The Athenians taught us to be citizens, to believe in the power of our own collective voice. And they taught us how to think, how to deconstruct our certainties, and how to use logic and reason to pursue the truth. They gave us the foundational code for our political software and the operating system for our intellectual lives. From the world of Greek ideas, we moved to the world of Roman pragmatism. In Rome, we saw the spirit of justice transformed into the machinery of law. The Roman jurists, through centuries of patient and systematic work, created a legal framework of such power and flexibility that it would become the bedrock of Western civilization. They gave us the principle of the rule of law, the belief in a system that is predictable, rational, and common to all. And they were not content to simply order their social world. They ordered their physical one. With their mastery of concrete, the arch, and the aqueduct, they engineered the infrastructure of a globalized world, a network of cities, roads, and water systems that bound a continent together. and set the very template for our modern urban existence. These legacies are not separate and distinct. They are a deeply interwoven inheritance. The philosophical ideals of the Greeks were debated and preserved in texts, a technology born in Mesopotamia. The Roman laws that governed the world were administered by a bureaucracy that relied on the written word. The great roads that the Roman legions built carried not just armies and goods, but the ideas of Greek philosophers and the legal principles of Roman jurists. Each civilization built upon the foundations of those who came before, creating a single, complex, and continuous cultural strand that stretches from the dawn of cities to our present moment. Our modern world is the product of this long, unbroken conversation across the millennia, and so we find ourselves surrounded by the ghosts of this ancient past. They are not the frightening specters of a dead world, but the quiet, foundational spirits that inhabit our most cherished institutions. The echo of the Sumerian scribe is in the email you will send tomorrow morning. The echo of the Athenian citizen is in the vote you will cast in the next election. The echo of the Roman jurist is in the legal contract you sign, and the echo of the Roman engineer is in the clean water that flows from your tap. The echo of the Greek philosopher is in the critical question you ask, and in the rational argument you use to defend your answer. History, then, is not a foreign country. It is the very room in which we live, the invisible architecture that shapes the contours of our lives. We are who we are because of the questions they asked, the systems they built, and the words they first dared to write down. To understand their world is not just an academic exercise. It is an act of self-discovery. For in the echoes of their ancient past, we can, if we listen closely enough, hear the powerful, resonant, and unending story of ourselves.